Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I'm still riding the wave of the EQ video we've done. You seem to enjoy it a lot. And some of you even enjoyed it a little too much for my liking, as I've received a non-zero number of comments calling me a bald PewDiePie. And all this suffering from success and social pressure I'm subjected to inspired the topic of this video: compression. Get it? If you've never heard of compression before, I'm talking about it in a context of audio, compressing actual sound. Me talking about audio and music on this channel? Subscribe for more. Let's move all the boring stuff out of the way first, so we can have fun later. And what's more boring than compression? Yeah, well, you still need to learn how to use it, and I will do my absolute best to make it as unboring as possible. I don't think that's a word, but you get the sentiment. And speaking of boring, my previous video sucked. Okay, fine, it's a good video, I bring up good points, but my presentation of that material sucked. That script and the way I was speaking feels like I'm delivering a thesis at gunpoint for an extra B+ that will not make any difference whatsoever anyway. So let's not do that again. I want to make things fun and accessible, not bore you to death. And if you have any ideas or requests, feel free to drop them in the comments or on my Instagram page. They're always welcome. Okay, time is money. This is how we're going to talk about compression. So first, I'm going to explain the general deal with it. What's compression and what do we use compression for? I'll keep it pretty short. Then a big one. We're going to talk about controls. I'll also give some more practical examples and use cases for common control values. Then, since we know about controls already, I'm going to talk about different compressor types. Unlike EQ, choosing different compressors has an audible effect on your audio/music, so if you don't understand those differences, you could be using a hammer where you should be using a lockpick. And since we're in that room, I'll also recommend some plugins to you as well. All of them are from experience, not sponsored. Do you really think someone will pay me money? And finally, the big one, the techniques. There's a boatload of compression techniques, and I will not be surprised if this chapter is like 60% of the video. Just know that you don't need to know every single thing right off the bat. I'll try to tier list them from most to least useful based on their position in that chapter. And that's about it. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe, and I would also like to give a 1-second shout out to the sponsor of today's video, my Patreon. Okay, 1 second's over. Let's go. First and foremost, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the cognitive nightmare that is a compressor, let's sit down and discuss what a compressor actually is. I want us to be on the same page, and there's a lot of confusion floating around both the purpose and inner workings of compressors. In an audio environment, a compressor is a piece of software or hardware that manipulates the dynamic range of a sound. Well, what's dynamic range? Dynamic range is the difference between the softest and loudest parts of a sound. What it essentially translates to in real life that if I were to whisper, and then after that talk really loudly, by engaging a compressor, I will make the whispers louder and my loud parts softer, bringing the two extremes closer together in volume. That's the general way of looking at it. Initially, compressors were made to protect the hardware. Imagine being at a concert, then say Slash comes from behind the stage. The crowd goes wild, he waves at them, the crowd gets even wilder. Then he strums a chord and a $500,000 speakers just fall out. To protect the equipment that costs more than a combined total of my organs on a black market, people invented compressors that keep the sound somewhat on a leash. So from one side it was that. From the other side it was radio stations that needed a way to match the volume of every song they were sending out. So if we want to put a more descriptive label on what compressors are doing, we could say that compressors shave decibels off of our sound while still preserving the information within them, to a reasonable degree. But hardware protection is hardly the reason we use compressors nowadays. It's become much more of a stylistic choice now. A compressor is how you make sure your voice sits well, your synthesizers aren't overpowering, and drums are nice, weighty, and punchy. And some genres even went to the length to have these super compressed sounds at the forefront of what the genre is known for, with a great example of that being these over-compressed dubstep drowns that were violating our eardrums for the last 15 years. I'm trying to say that compressors are everywhere, whether you notice them or not. You have to learn how to notice them, which, oh boy, presents a whole lot of headaches when you're not used to it. And of course, you have to learn how to use them, and pick the right one for the job. But we're going to talk about that later. Let's first talk about what knobs we can twist, what buttons we can press, and what all of them mean. Oh boy, I'm blending in with the background. Let me fix that. Okay, that's better. Compressors get a bad rap. Ask any beginner that's dipped their toes into music production, and they will confirm there is nothing more they hate in this life than compressors. As a tool, it falls under the category of if it's working properly, you will not notice it. People hate it. And much like there are 5 sides to a pentagram, there are 5 settings you need to be aware of whenever pretending to know what you're doing in front of your friends. The first and most important setting is called the threshold. It's often displayed as a line you can move around, up and down. A little unintuitive, but sure. So the way compressors work is that they don't compress all the sound, they don't act on its entire dynamic range. If they did, that would just be a volume slider. We don't want to lower the volume of the entire audio sample, we want to lower the volume that's too high for what we want to do with it. So the threshold setting determines at what volume the compressor turns on, just kicks in. Let me show you. Oh, and by the way, compressors are really hard to hear just by ear. Our ears just naturally suck at volume. So lots of compressors have a visual guide, much like this one. This is Ableton's stock compressor, if you're wondering. Right now, I am playing a simple piece of audio, a recording of me talking. You can see how the waveform is behaving in real time. By adjusting the threshold level, you're deciding at what volume the compressor snaps in and tries to lower everything that crosses it. Let's say we put it over here. As you can see, the highlighted part is what our compressor is actually reducing. So all in all, remember this. Everything below the threshold is unaffected, and everything above gets squished. By how much and in what way, we're going to talk about next. The second setting is called attack. You're going to hear that word a lot in music production. Think of it as a synonym for the word start. The attack of a kick is where the kick starts, for example. So keeping that in mind, what would a setting called attack mean on our compressor? You're smart enough, I think you've put 2 and 2 together already. Attack is the amount of time until the compressor starts working. But shouldn't it be working all the time? No, it shouldn't. Nice try though. Okay, maybe I should actually talk about it. Nowadays, we can usually go as granular as we want in terms of attack, being limited only by our compressor types. But that being said, for the next 30 seconds, focus on the words fast and slow. Fast engagement of a compressor, meaning as soon as the volume crosses the threshold line, the compressor instantly smashes it, is useful when there's too much of an attack on a sound, when it's too hot, for example. Think of a scream. You don't want it to explode your ears, you want that volume spike to be dealt with right away. Got it? Cool. The slower the engagement of the compressor, the more time that initial peak of the scream, I don't know why I'm still going with the scream example, the more time that initial part of the transient has to come through before getting slammed by the compressor. And that's kind of the gist of it. A fast attack equals more control, and a slow attack means less control. But don't we always want control? Hey look, an example. Let me tell you about transients. This is a waveform of a snare. That initial volume spike is what's called a transient. Look at it, it's sharp enough to cut yourself on if you're not careful. If your compressor's attack is fast, it quickly latches onto that transient and tries to reduce it. Let me over-exaggerate the sound to make it evident. Can you hear how squashed it is now? The compressor did not allow that transient through. But sometimes we want that. We want to hear that initial snare hit. In that case, we make the attack slower so that the emblematic snare transient can be heard well, and only when it's done, the compressor jumps in and compresses everything afterwards. I often call fast attack the dictatorship mode, because there's no way anything you don't want comes through. And I don't think I need to point out that the less attack there is, the less you're going to notice the compressor as well. The slower the attack, the less it feels like there's a compression on at all. And the truth as to which to choose for your purposes lies somewhere in the middle of the idea pile you have for your song. Compressors are a stylistic choice. Again, overcompressed dubstep is a clear example of that, and you have to look at everything you have around at your disposal to make a judgment. The same dubstep drums would be out of place in a live performance or opera or jazz setting, for example. To reiterate and kind of put a bow on everything, let me sum everything up like this. Fast attack is great to control your sound, but if you're not careful, it can suck the life out of it. It's audible compression, and it works best with sounds that have a sharp transient. So you're thinking bass, guitar, vocals, piano, and stuff like that. Slow attack is great when you're after a more natural sound, or when you want the initial transient to come through. Drums, for example. That being said, be careful, because if the performance of the instrument sucks, a slow compressor will make it sound even more inconsistent. The third setting is release. Release time goes hand in hand with the attack time. If the attack is how quickly the compressor latches onto a sound, release decides the amount of time after which it lets go of it. It's that Toy Story meme of "I don't want to play with you anymore," and the release knob decides how quickly that happens. Here we deal with the abstract concepts of short release times and long release times, or fast release and slow release, depending on the compressor. Much like with the attack, these terms mean very little in terms of actual values, because, come on, just use your ears. I cannot decide for you, it's your song. Fast release times means that the compressor will let go of the sound pretty fast. It's surprising, I know. This way the perceived loudness increases and things feel louder. Why? Because it adds excitement and aggression. But at the same time, be careful, because the sound can go wub 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 a little. Those are pumping artifacts, and usually that's not something you want. Slow release times are useful when you have sounds that taper off. A great example of that is bass. Think about how the bass works. It's the initial transient, which is the main bass note, and then it becomes quieter and quieter over time. Long release times on your compressor help to keep that bass from tapering off as much. This, for example, is the unprocessed bass. And this is how it sounds with a longer release time. Slow release on a compressor kind of smooths out the dynamics, but can also suck the life out of a sound. My voice right now, for example, is treated with a slow release on the compressor, so it feels natural even if I happen to move around the mic, thus messing with the volume a bit. Of course, release by itself will not tell the compressor how to act, and it's kind of the roadblock beginners just keep running into. Using a compressor is a dance of all 5 parameters, and to achieve the sound that you want, you have to use all 5 in an equal manner. It's a little finicky at first, but once you got used to it, you're just going to blaze through it. The fourth setting to know about is ratio. Insert an obligatory Twitter joke. I've seen a lot of confusion around ratio over years of me doing this, and I can't for the life of me understand why. I guess it confuses some people, but trust me, ratio is one of the easier things to understand. Fundamentally, ratio is the amount of gain reduction that happens when the sound crosses over the threshold. That's a mouthful. Let's explain it. If you take a look at the ratio values, you'll see 2 numbers with a colon in between them. I will not make the joke, I'm an adult. It looks like division, and it reads as, say, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 6-to-1. Let's keep it to 3-to-1 for our example. What it means is that for every 3 decibels that cross over the threshold, we only want 1. Or an even easier way to think about it, what's above the threshold will be a third as loud as it is now. If your ratio is 6-to-1, then what's above the threshold will be a sixth as loud as it is now, and so on. Needless to say, the higher the ratio, the more evident it's going to be, because it's going to be just shaving volume left and right. As far as linking ratio to instruments, I'm not really a fan of that. Different tutorials approach this differently. One may say, Use 6:1 ratio on bass, it's the best. The other one can go, no. 2:1. 2:1 is the absolute maximum you can go on bass. It's more natural. And honestly, neither one is wrong. They're not right either, it's just a subjective choice that I don't want to put the bottom line on. Use your ears, and when you feel like it's too much, dial it back, and you'll be just fine. The fifth setting is... You can't see it, but I'm slapping my knee. It's called knee. The knee determines how the compressor is handling the sound crossing the threshold. This one might feel a little unintuitive at first, but bear with me. A hard knee setting means that our sound, as soon as it crosses the threshold, that part above the threshold line is getting hit full force with the compressor. That is what you would expect the compressor to work like. Well, sometimes that's too aggressive. For those cases, we have the soft knee setting. It handles that transition in a different way. Instead of going from no compression to full compression at a snap of our fingers, it's a little more gradual. Usually the way it happens is that once our sound reaches the threshold line, it gets compressed lightly, and the closer it gets to the threshold, the more it gets compressed. Some compressors do it below the threshold, some do it above the threshold, but I think the most common way to do it is compressors that treat the threshold line as not a line, but a range of volume instead. Bottom line is that compression with the soft knee setting happens gradually until the full ratio amount is reached. That explanation probably sucks, but I don't know how to explain it better. It's one of those cases where you need to get your hands on a compressor because once you hear the difference, it's just going to be like, wow, evident. Consider this, the soft knee is a smoother and more natural sound in transition compared to a hard knee. And as far as controls go, we pretty much covered the common amalgamation of controls you can find. Different compressors have different approaches to it with some extra knobs you can twirl, sometimes boosting the volume or engaging a specific effect, but the main core of what compressors are, that's what we just talked about. It should be said, however, that a lot of the functionality of these parameters not only depends on your decision after you load the compressor, but it begins even earlier when you choose a compressor. Different compressor types have their own characteristics, which then can be controlled within the limits of that plugin, so it's important to understand what is the right tool for the job. Let's do that next. Another day, another recording session. Alright boys, I'ma be real. If you're a beginner, do you need all of this stuff I'm going to talk about right now? Probably not. But hear me out. I'm not going to treat you as beginners. This is a reputable YouTube channel I'm trying to run after all. So I'm going to present you with all the information, within reason of course, that you will have to run into sooner or later. If you're just starting out, and I always said this, stock plugins are fantastic, and chances are that your stock plugin is some weird amalgamation of all these types of compressors I'm going to mention is pretty high, jack of all trades type of thing. That being said, as you progress and become more experienced, you'll start realizing that some tools are better for specific jobs, and that's when this information will come in handy. If you've seen my EQ video, you might perceive some dissonance in my statement because, as I previously said, I like to keep my plugin choices to as few as possible. 1. It saves money. Money's great. 2. It removes the uncertainty that comes with having so many things that you cannot choose from them. That's still true, I am following my own advice, but compressors are where having that range of options is actually beneficial, because different compressor types have different ways in which they operate. There are 4 main types, and then there's a black sheep that's still really cool and you're gonna love it. The way I handle it is that I have one really good plugin for each type. All these plugins stood the test of time and I couldn't be happier with them, so let's discuss everything in more detail. First on the list are optical compressors, also referred to as opto compressors. Optical means relating to sight, especially about the action of light, and that's exactly how these compressors operate. Hardware units of these have photocells, and they use light as a factor of measurement when it comes to compression. The higher the amplitude, volume, of the sound on the way in, the higher the intensity of the light being emitted inside of them, and the more gain is being attenuated once the photocells detect that light. Redundant information, but I wanted to share it with you because it's pretty cool. What does that mean for us though? Optical compressors offer a slow, smooth, and neutral sound in compression, also called transparent because it introduces no color. It's great for everything that requires transparency, and the example I always give is that of opera vocals. It helps to smooth out the sustained performances and even out the sound, so it would be great for something like bass as well. But one thing that you have to take into account is that due to their overall slowness, these are not really useful if you need to control sharp transients. The transient is simply going to be over before the compressor even begins to kick in. In a world of compressors, we have a couple of hardware units that everybody wants to emulate. Teletronic's LA2A is one such gem, an excellent optical compressor. But many years ago, my hipster mind said no, so I use a different optical compressor, the Softtube TubeTag CL1B. I love Softtube, I don't know who doesn't, aside from my CPU. But that's not the point. The point is that this is my main optical workhorse, and I kept using it throughout my career and throughout the years, and I don't really have complaints, so yes, I fully recommend it. Either this or any of the thousands of Teletronic's LA2A emulations you're going to find online. All of them just get my stamp of approval, they're all great. Next, time to fat shame. It's FAT, spelled F-E-T, no need to log on to Twitter. FAT stands for Field Effect Transistor, and they use electric fields to control the signal. It feels like something out of sci-fi, like straight from Mass Effect. Considering how fast electricity travels, these compressors are by far the fastest ones, both in terms of attack and release. Plugins as well. But the speed comes at a cost. Which isn't a bad thing actually, I'm just being overly dramatic. Fat compressors add harmonic distortion. Think like a mini saturation plugin that colors your sound that's just permanently stapled onto a compressor. So no wonder these things are everywhere on drums, just ubiquitous. These are responsible for that punchy sound you find in the rock and metal records. This is a compressor that loves to be punished and pushed really hard. Make your own jokes, this is a family-friendly channel. So which one is in my arsenal? If there are some really experienced people among you watching this, you're probably thinking one of two things. Either UA 1176, which is one of the gems of the industry, much like the LA2A we discussed previously, or a drummer. I love drummer, but I wanted to simplify my plugin selection, so you're correct, 1176 it is. And more specifically, Artoria's emulation of it. Comp Fat 76. These names, Jesus Christ. Why? Because it's cheap and I didn't have to bundle buy plugins. It's great, it's fantastic even. It's my go-to fat compressor and I love it as if it were my own child. The third entry on our list is tube compressors, most often called variable MU or variable gain compressors. These are a little odd. Their main gimmick is that they do not allow you to change the ratio of compression. The compressor itself decides the ratio, based on how hot the signal is once it's fed into the compressor. The hotter, the more it's going to get absolutely slammed. These are on the slower side, both in attack and release, and they do come with a distinctive sound to them. Much like fat compressors, variable MU play with harmonics a little bit, which makes sense considering tubes are involved in their circuitry. So they do have a characteristic sound and use case. Most often these are used to glue things together and make everything sound cohesive. So think buses, which is essentially sending several tracks to one channel so they can be processed together, and mastering, which are its main kind of use cases. And the plugin that found its way into my heart and arsenal will be of no surprise to anybody who knows what they're doing. It's the Fairchild, and I have to confess that I am cheating myself out of my own plugin selection logic here, because I use two versions of it. Universal Audio Fairchild 660 and 670. They're essentially the same plugin, but one is mono and one is stereo. Stereo is for buses and mastering, and mono is if I happen to want to throw it on bass or something. Still, it's the same plugin, so my conscience is clear. And the last widely accepted compressor type is the VCA compressor. This is what's likely to be in your hands right now. Usually, stock dock compressors are similar to VCA. So this one, once again, uses electricity to control its gain reduction, so it's very fast, but still not as fast as a FET. But even if we want to consider it second place speed-wise, Unlike FET, these are transparent because they do not color nor distort the sound in any way, shape, or form. At least not in any noticeable way. This is a compressor that's malleable enough to go from smooth to aggressive in the right hands, making it a jack of all trades of sorts, and the obvious choice if you're just stranded on a deserted island and only have the option to take only one compressor with you. And once again, my plugin selection will not surprise anybody. DMX 160VU is one of the cherished VCA compressors, so I have an emulation of that, VC160 from Native Instruments. I've had this bad boy since 2016, 17, I believe. And all things considered, it is a weird pick. You see, usually VCA compressors allow you an extreme amount of control, just ridiculous, possibly more than you will ever need. But this one takes that control away from you. You can't even decide the attack and release times. Why is that? Why didn't I go for something like Softtube's VCA compressor since I love Softtube so much? Honestly, because I'm just used to it. I want the least amount of controls so I don't have to think. I am lazy and stupid. I don't use third-party VCAs a lot anyway. If I feel like I need something similar to this, I'll just load the stock Ableton compressor. It's similar enough. Still, don't get me wrong, 160 is a great plugin and is a great VCA compressor. And now that we're done with the main 4 entries in this list, time to discuss the odd one out. It's called a Distressor. Rather than being a compressor type, it's a specific unit that's being emulated that's just so wild that it needs a separate category. The model in question is the Empirical Labs EL8, and it's the odd one out because it somewhat mimics what other compressors are doing, with different compression curves and circuitry inside of it. And on top of that, it allows for different distortion modes. That's where it's got its name from. It's distortion, compressor, Distressor. The wildest thing about the Distressor is that we can achieve just inhuman levels of gain reduction without even noticing much. There's been plenty of times where I got 10 to 12 decibels of gain reduction without wanting to throw up, which is a miracle. Usually at that level you start dialing back because it's like way too much. Which is why it makes me mad that you don't hear the Distressor being talked a lot about, and I do think it needs a bit of a revival arc. Essentially, these units were made to substitute the entire range of compressors in the studio, and yeah, it does things pretty well. I wouldn't go as far as to say you can turn it from an optical into a FET, of course not, but what it lacks in excessive malleability it makes up for in character. And compared to the other compressors where we can control just parameters of the detector, which is attack, release, ratio, here we can change the character, and that's the interesting part about this one. As my distressor of choice, I use Arouser by Empirical Labs, the same guys who made the original. Now, if you're salivating at the prospect of getting your hands on this, hold your horses. Not to discredit it, but I see this one as more of a toy rather than a stable workhorse. I'm not going to stop you if you want to get your hands on it, because I get it, but you get more mileage out of one of the 4 main compressors we discussed earlier, in my opinion. Okay, it's time to rip the band-aid off. You have no idea how many times I've just woken up, looked at my computer and the sticky note saying to do compression techniques, and just thought to myself, maybe tomorrow. But alas, the band-aid has to come off sooner or later, so let's do it now. You might not be aware of this, but there are many compression techniques for many different use cases. I didn't even realize how many there were until I sat down to write them all for this very video. I'm going to go through all of them and try to explain them to the best of my abilities while keeping things as short as possible. I've toyed around with the idea of making this a really in-depth compression tutorial akin to the one I did on EQ, but the truth of that is, if I have to go through every single technique in as much depth as they warrant, it would maybe take me about 40 minutes for each of them, so I'm going to just limit myself to talking about these techniques in broad strokes. My goal here is to make you understand what these techniques imply, how to effectively set them up, and apply them in a real-life scenario. And as well discuss some common environments where you can find these techniques used. Everything without wasting too much of your time, so if you're interested, you can further the research by yourself if you want to. And speaking of wasting time, let's stop doing that and let's move on to the actual list. So as of me writing this, I came up with, I think, 11 common compression techniques that are widely used in the industry. If I missed something, I'm sorry, let me know in the comments below. I know for a fact, actually, I missed mid-side compression, so why would I not include it then? Because mid-side processing is like a 2-hour video in itself, and I cannot in good faith make it a simple footnote and check it as if it's done. For one, it's not only related to compression, but effects like EQ as well. That's one. Second, the thing is it introduces some level of phase issues, and it's generally a topic that we need to sit down and talk about properly. That's like the birds and the bees discussion, and I will make it as awkward as possible, I promise. Sometime in the future, but that's not why we're here today. So the very first technique is downward compression, and for good measure, I will throw upward compression in here as well. The two are pretty similar. Compressors work by reducing the dynamic range of a sound, meaning they take a listen to the softest and loudest points of a sound and just bring them closer together. Downward compression is what everybody thinks about whenever they think about compression. It's the squashing of everything above the threshold line. It's what we talked about in our controls part of the video. So once the signal crosses over the threshold, it is detected by the compressor, and the compression is applied according to the parameters that you have set yourself. So attack, release, ratio, everything. So I'm going to take a drum loop, I'm going to slam it really hard with the compressor, and I'm going to gradually lower the threshold line. So let's see what it sounds like. Having a compressor with a visual representation of what is happening is really useful. As you can see, my peaks are getting squashed a little already, even though it's not audible enough just yet. For now, I want you to focus on how the compressor is operating as I'm lowering the threshold. I'm not going to introduce any makeup gain just yet. If you're listening on cheap headphones or maybe laptop speakers, you may not hear any difference besides a difference in volume, because, yeah, we're reducing dynamic range. But if YouTube gods smile down on us, you will hear that while the hi-hats are staying relatively unchanged from what they were before, this isn't the case for the snare and kick. They feel a lot more squashed. But here's the kicker. No pun intended. Let me default everything to the way it was before, and let me click the Makeup button. With the makeup engaged, the output level is compensated as the threshold lowers. What this essentially means is that the volume level is going to stay the same as I'm going to lower the threshold, and this will make you more aware of what the compressor is actually doing here. Well, can you hear the difference? I know I said the volume will stay unchanged, and you know what? I was not lying. The perceived volume has changed. Your ears are now tricked into thinking that things are louder now. So why is that? It's because the dynamic range, which is the difference between the soft hi-hats and the loud snare, is less than what it used to be. So things just feel louder. And as I moved the threshold to the lowest points I could, you started hearing reverb being introduced. It's because the dynamic range is so tiny that it starts to include things like room noise. Everything is so squished and soft that once you bring it up to level with makeup gain, you can even hear the room noise. Again, let me unpause and let you hear how things sound now, with and without makeup gain. Pretty wild, right? That's downward compression for you, squishing things above the threshold line. But this isn't over, is it? I mentioned the upward compression exists as well. Most conventional compressors don't even include the option of upward compression because, truth be told, there's no real reason to use it. In fact, it might even be problematic. The thing is, with downward compression, you can slam the signal as hard as you want with no real issue. But since upward compression deals with signals below the threshold, it might be a problem. Think about what can be below the threshold line. Silence, for example. This would mean that once there is a millisecond of silence in your audio, the gain on that tiny moment would just instantly shoot up, potentially revealing lots of problems. That's not a noise floor, that's a noise ceiling now. So why would you use upward over the downward? Honestly, both approaches are kind of interchangeable. Dan Worrell in this video makes an excellent example of a guitar that he wants to reduce the harshness of and at the same time increase the lows and the mids. So he takes a multiband compressor, more on that later, and he just adjusts that on the fly. But then, again, the same can be done by twisting the makeup gain with no real difference in sound. It's the quote-unquote intuitiveness of the process that's slightly different, and it's up to you to choose which one you want to use. Personally, I'm pretty sure that the number of times I've used upward compression is less than the number of fingers I have on my hands, so paint me as a skeptic in terms of its immediate usefulness. But it also may be the case of I'm just so used to the old thing that I don't see the need to change. Okay, next up we have something that doesn't quite belong here, but whatever is left on my conscience made me write this anyway. You see, compressors are only half the equation. They reduce dynamic range. But what if instead you wanted to expand that dynamic range? Well, in that case, stop looking at compressors and start looking at expanders. Actually, never mind, keep your eyes on your compressors, they do often have that option. Expansion, much like compression, can also be facing downward or upward. In terms of operation, they're exact opposite of compressors. So what does that mean in real terms? With the upward expansion, the signals that cross over the threshold increase in volume. With the downward expansion, the signals below the threshold decrease in volume. Yes, it's fundamentally the same functionality, much like downward and upward compression. So to reduce the mental fog, it can be easier to think of these four techniques, so upward compression, upward expansion, and downward expansion as simply compression and expansion, with one reducing the dynamic range and the other one increasing it. Needless to say, use compression when you want to bring parts that stick out closer to the others, while use expanders when you want to make things stick out. Okay, let's move that nightmare sequence out of our peripheral. Time to talk about something that feels less like a lobotomy. Parallel compression, also known as the New York compression. This is my baby. This is what I overuse on everything I do, but you cannot stop me. The very gist of parallel compression is to have two separate tracks of the same thing. Let's keep it to drums, as usual for simplicity. You take one track, slam it extremely hard with compression, to the point of it being really noticeable and processed, and then you blend the processed signal with the unprocessed one, until you like the result. I cannot even begin to tell you how much I love this. But the most astute of you that think they can cheat the system might come up with the question: why use two tracks instead of just using the dry-wet knob that's on every compressor nowadays? That's a great idea, and I didn't come up with an answer right away. I'm actually a little ashamed of that. The short answer is that having two separate tracks allows for even more control. This way you have a completely clean signal that you can then send off to buses or effects without affecting or compromising the other track that's already been processed by our compressor. So what does this work on? Well, honestly, pretty much everything. But situations in which it will work the best, in my opinion, are those involving low-end frequencies. Think bass, think drums. This is also where you can slam the compressor really hard, and I mean to the point of it breaking the sound. And since you will not be listening to the processed sound alone, but it's only going to function as a foundation layer to the clean sound on top of it, you can get away with some really wild stuff. That being said, do not confuse parallel compression with parallel processing. Compression falls under that bigger umbrella of processing, but the two are fundamentally different. Well, not different, but the parallel processing is having two more tracks with different effects that you blend together, and parallel compression refers only to that effect of compression. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that parallel processing exists for every effect. So when you're reading tutorials or something, don't let your brain autocomplete with compression as soon as you read parallel, okay? Next up, sidechain. We're getting into some juicy territory right here. Once you start sidechaining things, you've officially outgrown the beginner title in my eyes. Sidechain is when one audio track controls the effects on another track. And what we refer to as sidechain most often, although the right word for it would be ducking, is the volume control of one track that gets lowered when the other track is playing. I'm bad at putting this into words, let me just show you what's happening. Here we have a bass line and we have a kick drum. This is the most practical and most common application of a sidechain. Listen to how they sound together with no sidechain applied to them. The two tracks have frequencies that are kind of masking each other. It's not that uncommon in low frequencies, which makes this a great showcase. So the idea here is to make the kick powerful enough to cut through the bass. Now, you could do this by increasing the volume of the kick or messing with the EQ of the bass line. But those aren't really solutions, because in the first case you're messing up the overall volume levels, and then the second one you're taking away precious information for nothing. So the general idea here is to lower the volume of the bass right as the kick comes in, and increase it once the kick is over. So the bass line is pretty stable in its volume, if not for the times when the kick is playing. This way we don't have any issues when a kick is not playing, and when it does, we can hear it loud and clear. So to do that, a lot of compressors allow you to sidechain. I have my old trusty Ableton compressor here loaded on the bass track. I expand the options available to me and click the sidechain button. Where it says audio from, I select my kick. This is where the compressor is going to take trigger information from, and we're done. This way, bass and kick are not conflicting with each other any longer. So will this work on things other than kicks? Of course. You can use sidechains wherever you want to make one piece of audio cut through another one without really affecting it long term. It can work on vocals, pads, guitars, bass, drums, you name it. But it's most evident in the bass plus drums duo, especially bass and kick, as these two are conflicting the most. Next on our list is something we've already seen mentioned previously, and it's multiband compression. Whenever we talked about upward and downward compression and expansion, you've already seen this on your screen. Multiband compressors are really easy to understand, but they provide a really convenient level of flexibility to your songs. It's less of a technique and more of a different tool that you're bringing to the table. So if a regular compressor works by taking the entirety of the signal and then acting upon it according to the parameters you provided, multiband compressors allow you to dial specific parts of the signal you want the compressor to act on. It's like the difference between graphic and parametric equalizers we've previously talked about, in the sense that both parametric EQs and multiband compressors allow you to pinpoint specific ranges of frequencies that you see as problematic or that you want to enhance. And once you have the signal split into different bands, you can dial in the settings for each one separately, which is great if you don't want a uniform blueprint applied to everything. It can even allow you to use both upward and downward compression at the same time without loading two compressors. It's a really versatile tool, and I do suggest getting your hands on one and learning the ins and outs of it. FabFilters Pro MB, standing for Pro Multiband. I cannot talk. Basically, this thing is the clear winner here. It's one of those tools that have sped up my entire workflow once I get used to it, because I no longer need to fidget with automation, buses, or load 2 or 3 plugins on the same track to do what a multiband compressor does in the box. So the bottom line to multiband compressors is that they do add a little guesswork, because you do have to dial the bands you want to compress yourself, but at the same time, it removes way more guesswork and time sink that it introduces. It's a confusing statement, I know, but if you've never used one of these and have been producing for a while, you'll appreciate and will notice a difference. And would I advise a beginner to start learning multiband compression right away? No, absolutely not. A multiband compression is not a substitute for regular compression, it's just another notch on the list, and you'll get way more mileage out of regular compressors to do things regular compressors do. Multiband compressors shine in the hands of those that already have their ideas clear and are an additional tool rather than a full-blown replacement. Next on our list, we can find limiters. This is another case of an additional tool rather than a substitute for a compressor. All limiters are technically compressors, I guess, but not all compressors are limiters, even though some of them can be turned into one. Anyway, the point is, limiters are compressors with extremely high ratios. Usually, anything above 10:1 would be effectively considered limiting. But what's the deal here? Limiters and limiting are used to protect the signal from clipping and, as a consequence, from being distorted. As much as possible, of course. It does so while allowing you to increase the perceived loudness of that signal. Limiters have instant attack times to latch onto the signal as soon as they detect it going over the threshold. As you might hear and see, once the snare got too loud, the limiter just started shaving off the volume there. Honestly speaking, it sounds like crap when you push it too hard. Everything got louder, which is good, but the volume that's shaving off, that's not it, chief. The snare lost all of its power. And that's kind of the point of my point. Avoid excessive limiting, much like what I've showcased in that example. You're just going to get nowhere. Your mix is just going to look like a boiled sausage. That's not what you want. This is a healthier representation of it. So, how should you use a limiter? Well, usually if it lowers a little volume, it's absolutely fine. It's barely noticeable and it's worth it, considering the improvement in overall perceived loudness. But the main point of limiters is being able to monitor the entirety of the peaks in our signals and making sure that we're not pushing the signal too hard while still making it loud enough for commercial usage. It's usually the last effect in a chain, and personally I treat it as a way to see whether everything before the limiter makes sense, transient-wise. If not, I'd much rather just tweak the compressor rather than the limiter itself. Much like mid-side processing, limiting requires a separate video for me to be happy with my explanation, even though you have this brief overview and introduction over here. Not because it's a really in-depth topic and there's lots of information to sift through, but simply because it's an often misunderstood concept, so lots of time people just get it wrong. It's one of those cases where I would just rather have a separate video that you can consult whenever in doubt. Especially considering that we need to talk about perceived loudness, LUFS, mastering, and all that good stuff. But technically it's still a compression technique because it attenuates sound, as opposed to a clipper, which is another type of plugin that just shaves it off and introduces distortion. Anyway, that's the gist of limiters. I'm sure I'll make a video on them soon enough. Next on our list, leveling. Again, it's technically an extra tool to provide a result that can be achieved with a compressor. Levelers in many ways are predecessors to all the compression options we have right now. They usually had a fixed ratio around 5:1 and only allowed you to dial in the amount of peak reduction and overall gain. Some people love these, some people don't see the point in keeping these around any longer, and I do happen to fall on the latter side of that equation. In modern settings, levelers are not very used, and there's a huge asterisk there. And to understand why, we need to understand what is their purpose. They're here to level out the sound by still reducing the dynamic range, but in a context of things feeling more natural. A good example that comes to mind is pausing between sentences. Contrasting speech with complete silence can sometimes be jarring, so they are somewhat trying to level out the playing field. Or more practical usage is when you are having a conversation with people who are different distances away from their microphones. Levelers in this case would allow for more natural flow in conversation by trying to play with the volume of individual, microphones. If you're a good student and have been following this entire video, you might come to the same conclusion I did, that levelers just sound like an optical or VCA compressors with fewer steps. And you're not wrong. The world-famous Teletronics LA2A is both an optical compressor and a leveler. There are still people who swear by these units. Levelers, I mean. Past the point of what a regular compressor can bring to the table, and I am not going to be the one to argue. My 2 cents is that personally I'll look at and treat LA2A as a compressor, and other nuances can come afterward if we really want to care. I don't think I'm missing something here, but if you know something I don't, feel free to correct me. I'm always happy to learn. Finally, we're at the end of our list. The last technique is De-Essing, and it can be an extra plugin if we want it to be. I think you can figure out yourself what it does. It deals with the sibilants, the s and sh sounds that are coming out of our mouths and other orifices. Sibilance is annoying, and there are several ways of dealing with it. The first one is by using a compressor. Makes sense to start with this one considering the title of this video. It's as simple as slapping a multiband compressor on your vocal take, then fishing around the 2-3 kHz range. If you really need, you can go as high as 3.5. Check the EQ video where I explained how to actually find sibilants. After you're happy with your band, just compress it in a way that only the sibilance is affected and it doesn't bother you anymore. That's all there is to it. It's quite literally the same procedure that I've outlined in the EQ video, with the difference being that instead of perma-lowering the volume of that band, we just compress it and make it quieter by reducing the dynamic range. Is there any significant difference between the EQ and compression in that circumstance? Should you go for one instead of another? Nothing significant. The way I usually go about it is I ask myself, do I want to throw the compressor first or the EQ first? Whatever I throw in first, I'll just do it there. So the first option is a compressor, the second is EQ, and the third one is a separate plugin. I have a FabFilter Pro DS here as my de-esser of choice, but here's a question. Why would I use something like this when I can just manually dial it? What sense does it make to have a separate plugin that does the same thing your main plugin does? And I'm going to answer your question by saying that it does not matter, and the only reason I have it and use it is that I am lazy. I have a preset for my voice that I made, and it's just a process of turn de-esser on, click the preset, close the window, and move on. I do it for my videos, and I wouldn't really do it in any other scenario. Once I matured enough to realize that, oh, I can just do it myself, and even better, I stopped caring about de-essers in professional environments. I don't mean to say they're not good. It's a tool, and it will find its uses if you really want to, but don't go out of your way to get these if you already have advanced compressors or EQs that can target that frequency that's giving you problems. And oh boy, with that, we are done with compression. This is a weird one because from the outside, it seems like this big insurmountable achievement to understand, but once you actually sit down and try to wrap your head around it, it clicks that, oh, it's just that. The biggest challenge is by far learning to hear compression than to actually use it. The trick is usually to dial it just enough so you start hearing the effect it does, and then scale it back until you stop hearing it. If you want things to remain transparent, of course. If you want to slam the signal, you can always just do that and go wild. But that's pretty much it. Hope you had some semblance of fun sitting through this. Hope you learned something new as well. And if you did, let me know in the comments and subscribe for more. You will not have to wait long for the new video, and I can tell you right now that we're staying on the software side of things. I want to knock everything off of that list while we're here. But that's in the future. For now, take a well-deserved rest. I will see you in the next one. Stay sharp. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Victor V, and I am out.